Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you to the third day of our 5-day series entitled Journey Through Time, Conversations with the World's Great Women and Men. Before we introduce today's program, we have a very special moment that we want to pause to honor someone who has been very, very dear and special to the series that we've had over the years and to me personally as a great friend. Would you join me in welcoming to the podium today, Katie Manns. Katie has been manager of the auditorium for a number of years, and all the programs that we have put together, she and her staff have worked very closely with us to make sure every detail was in place, and sometimes that was at the last minute when we did not know exactly what we might be doing. And last year on our 25th anniversary, we had a tremendous celebration, and she was responsible for even getting a number of the speakers that we have. She has resigned her position here to do other things, and today's her last day, and I wanted to recognize her and thank her for all the work she's done. It's been absolutely outstanding, and we thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your host today to introduce this program this morning is the chair of the North Idaho College Division of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Tom Flint.
Good morning, and thank you all for coming. I also, on behalf of the Popcorn Forum, want to welcome you all to today's talk on W. Edwards Deming, a management theorist and 20th century philosopher who history will likely record as one of the most important and influential thinkers of this century. His ideas about how things are made, how services are delivered, and how organizations conduct their affairs are having tremendous impact all around the world toward improving the quality of life and work. You may not realize it, but everyone in this room is already enjoying the benefits of Dr. Deming's work. To help us explore the life and thought of W. Edwards Deming, we are privileged to have with us today Mr. Lou Schultz, a longtime personal friend and assistant and biographer of Dr. Deming. Lou Schultz is founder and chief executive officer of Process Management International, or PMI, and is recognized internationally as a leader in the field of quality improvement. His firm PMI was founded to assist private government organizations throughout the world, private and government organizations throughout the world with planning and implementation of quality management principles. He serves on the board of directors of the Minnesota Council for Quality and the editorial board of Human Systems Management. He is a member of the Asian Pacific Congress on Quality Control, an advisor to the North Central Deming Management Forum, a recipient of the University of Minnesota's 1987 Professional Partnership Award, and a member of the Council of Growing Companies. The Council of Growing Companies. He is also the author of Profiles in Quality, which I think is a really excellent work that gives you a very good overview of the development of the quality movement and all of the major contributors to that, and then concludes with a very useful and practical synthesis of all of these ideas. So I would strongly recommend Profiles in Quality to any of you who are interested in exploring quality improvement. He's also co-author of the Quality Workbook for Small Businesses and co-author of Deming, The Way We Knew Him, and co-author of the TQM Transformation. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Mr. Lou Schultz.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. Your applause reminds me of a presentation I heard one morning by the author of Service America. And Ron Zemke received applause and he's introduced, and he said, gosh, I don't really know how to act this way because I normally don't get much applause. But say one day I was giving a presentation. I thought I heard an applause in the back of the room. And I strained my eyes to see who it was back there. And I looked, and there was some darn guy that brought his hamburger in. He was sitting back there with a bottle of ketchup going. So I appreciate your applause this morning. New cars were not produced in this country from mid-1942 to mid-1946. You could not buy chewing gum during that period. You could not buy candy bars. If you smoked, you could get wings or Cools if you were really lucky. Food was rationed. You couldn't buy as much food as you wanted. But that was okay because we were united to win the war. And we were willing to put up with these sacrifices that were brought upon on December 7th, 1941, when we had this attack on Pearl Harbor. And we were not prepared for that attack. You know, the production of Europe and Asian countries had been geared to producing wartime supplies in the late 30s. They'd been preparing for war. But we were not prepared in this country. We did not expect it. We thought the oceans would buffer us and we could stay out of it. We were wrong. So when that attack came, we had to very quickly do something to gear up our production to produce these wartime supplies. So Detroit started manufacturing tanks and airplanes. And factories all around the country were changed over to produce products that they'd never made before. Something had to be done in order to prepare these companies to ramp up at the rate that we did to produce these wartime goods. And some statisticians, Deming, Grant, Lewis, Schultz, and others were asked to put together a training program for manufacturing operations in this country so that they could produce very rapidly and efficiently with high quality the goods we needed to enter the war and to become a part of the war. They started out as a 10-day training course at Stanford, which very quickly spread around the country. And there were thousands and thousands of American manufacturing people that were put through this training. And it was tremendously successful. You know, we built Liberty ships, freighters, in 30 days' time from beginning to flotation. And they did float, you know, and they still do. There's still some out there. And that's probably the real untold story of the Second World War, is how we were able to ramp up our production. But then some things happened, and it sort of changed where we are in the world. What I've tried to do here is to compare throughout history some things that have happened in the United States and Japan. The width of the line denotes the level of quality of the goods and services produced in the two countries. And before the war, our quality was quite good. And then it improved during the war with this training that was developed by Deming and working in the others. And our quality improved. The Japanese had some good products. The Zero was a good product, but most of you probably remember, or not most of you are too young, you don't remember, but maybe there are a couple of you out there that are old enough like I am to remember when something said made in Japan, you were fortunate if it worked by the time you got out of the front door of the store. I mean, it was really schlocky stuff. It was terrible stuff, you know, and the quality was terrible. And we laughed at something that said made in Japan. It became so bad that one of the Japanese islands renamed themselves USA, so they could stamp on their products, made in USA. That's a true story, by the way. And so what happened was after the war, there was a significant difference. In the United States, we had gone without material goods for about 5 years, 4 or 5 years. And so there was tremendous pent-up buying demand because most of us that were not in the service made a lot of money during the war. You know, the price of corn and beef and that was nearly what it is today here, and the costs were infinitely less. So the farmers made a lot of money. A lot of the people that were not in service went to either coast to work in war plants. That's where we first started getting two-income families in this country. So we had pockets full of money, nothing to spend it on during the war. And when the war was over, we lost our vision to win the war. I mean, that was it. So now we wanted to catch up. And we went on a huge buying spree. I remember people getting into fist fights to see who would get to pay twice the sticker price for a new car. You know, why not? The old one's worn out, had a lot of money. So what if it cost me twice what it is? I want that car. I deserve it. I need it. And so we went on this big buying spree, but it wasn't only in this country. If you stop to think about it, we didn't have any competition in North America because the production capacity of Europe and Asia was pretty much destroyed by the war. So the whole world was looking to us for products and services. And what we as management did is put our emphasis on quantity, not quality. You know, get the stuff out the door. We'll take care of the problems later. Ship it. Ship as is. And so we shipped everything. And some of you, again, might remember back in the 50s and 60s when we bought a new car, we keep a notepad in the car to write down all the things wrong with it, right? So we wouldn't forget when we went back to dealer to tell them about all the problems we were having so they could fix them. You know, and then one day we kind of woke up, we found out, hey, we can buy a new car that doesn't have these problems. We don't need to keep track of all the things wrong with it because there aren't any things wrong with it. It works. We found out we could buy computers, for example, that worked out of the box instead of having 2 weeks of some engineer bringing them online. And so what happened is that we went blindly down our path of focusing on quantity in this country, while the Japanese were slowly but surely improving their quality. When the war was over, they were hungry to learn about what we had done to improve our manufacturing. And they invited Dr. Deming over to teach them. And he went over in 1950 and then annually thereafter. One of the things he learned in this country is that he did not have the top managers in his classes during the war. So he went to Japan. He vowed that he would not make that mistake again. And so he said, okay, I'll come over, but I insist that your top managers take the training themselves. And 21 people were invited to that first class. All 21 showed up. And what he later found out was that those 21 people represented 80% of the wealth of Japan. He truly had the top leaders of the country, both education and industry, in his classes. And they applied his teachings themselves. In subsequent years when he came over, they proudly showed him their own work, what they had done to improve their work processes and educational processes in their country. So what we've come up with here is that they have worked to continually improve their quality, and I think we all understand now that something made in Japan is pretty good quality, but we're improving here too. And we sort of woke up in this country in, I think it was May of 1980, when NBC showed a white paper, if Japan can, why can't we? And it was all about this guy Deming and what he had done in Japan was now doing in the United States to teach his management philosophy to people that wanted to improve their processes, their operation, their way of management so they could improve the performance of their organizations. And we have been improving ever since, and we'll talk about some of those examples later on. But let's see if I can get this to work here. Okay, maybe if I could get you to advance here one and just blank out the overhead up to the slide because I don't see. There we go. Wonder what's made. York Controls Incorporated. That sounds suspiciously American, doesn't it? Okay. What this leads us to believe is that this philosophy taught by Dr. Deming is really the bridge to our future. And that's a point that we'd like to make on this, is that there is an opportunity to us, but we have to be the one to walk across the bridge. Let's go back into the past a little more and talk about this guy Deming. He was born in 1900 in Sioux City, Iowa. And a couple of years later, he moved to Cody, Wyoming, and a couple of years after that to Powell, Wyoming. Now, I have to get that in because my wife is from Wyoming, and she'll let me have it if I don't get in that plug for the state of Wyoming as producing this fine gentleman. He received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wyoming and his master's from the University of Colorado, and after some years' experience, his PhD from Yale. And he went to work for the Department of Agriculture. And while he was there, one of his supervisors suggested that he might want to travel to England to see what a man was doing named Sir Ronald Fisher, developing something called statistics that was used in agriculture. Statistics really got to start in agriculture because they have a problem in doing some testing, and that you can really only conduct about one test a year because of the growing season. So they had to develop some tools that would allow them to get more information out of their testing. And that's where it started. So Deming took a year's leave of absence and got on a ship and went to England and to Oxford University, where he spent a year studying under Sir Ronald Fisher. And he said he was probably the worst teacher that he ever had in his life because his teaching skills were abysmal. But people came from all over the world to study under him because they wanted to see how a great mind worked. And he was a great mind. He later came over to this country and was on the staff of Iowa State University for several years. But Deming studied under him, and he came back, and this same supervisor of his said, well, you know, there's a man over at Bell Labs, Walter Schuhart, that might be interesting for you to get to know. So Deming contacted Schuhart, and they became very good friends and studied together. And then the Department of Agriculture had their own graduate program that they conducted, and Deming was asked to use Schuhart and some of these other people to put on evening courses in statistics. Deming developed a list of things that he thought were wrong with U.S. management, and he called them the deadly diseases and obstacles that organizations have. The first one, excuse me, let me back up just a minute, because in talking about Deming when he was in Japan, there's something else I wanted to show you here. He was not the first American to go to Japan after the war. When MacArthur came into Japan, he was named the Supreme Allied Commander, and he found himself faced with 100 million starving people. And he sent a telegram back to President Truman and said, either send me food or send me guns, because I'm going to need one or the other. And so we did send food over there. A lot of it was food that was totally foreign to the Japanese, but they were starving, so they ate just about anything we sent to them. And MacArthur determined that he needed to be able to communicate with the people directly. So he brought two Americans over. One is to set up a telephone system, and another man named Homer Saracone to set up a wireless system. And Saracone said that transmitters were not a problem. The Army had lots of transmitters. But how do you get receivers in the hands of 100 million starving people that don't have the money to buy food, let alone buy radio sets? So they set up production of low-cost radios. And some of the very famous companies we're aware of today were actually started by Saracone, building the low-cost radios. Saracone said when he arrived in Japan, it reminded him of the television views of Florida after the hurricane a couple of years ago. He said there was so much debris in the streets in the Tokyo-Yokohama axis that you could not drive a Jeep through there. You could barely walk down the streets. And the people there were convinced that we won the war with the secret weapon. No, it was not the atomic bomb. It was not our superior military might, nor our superior strategy that won the war. But that secret weapon was the training that we gave our manufacturing operations that allowed them to ramp up production of wartime supplies at the pace that we did. There we go. I know you can't read that. This is a copy of an actual poster about that training. And this is dated February 11th, 1944. It happened to be this particular poster that was 8 days of training in Los Angeles offered by Stanford University. And it says that it was training that was developed, again, by working Deming, Grant and Lewis in 1942. This right here is a copy of what the Japanese feel is a secret weapon that allowed us to win World War II. And that's what I'd like to share a little bit with you today on this secret weapon here that we have. So now let's get back into what this secret weapon is, what it constitutes here. The 7 deadly diseases that Deming talked about, by the way, there are 14 points that we'll talk about later. There are 7 deadly diseases. There are 7 quality tools. There are 7 management tools. 7 is a lucky number in Japan, and that's why the number tends to come out, and 7 are multiples of 7. But the first disease that Deming talked about that's wrong with our operations is a lack of constancy of purpose. We tend to vacillate back and forth. We change managers in many operations every couple of years, just as sort of a matter of principle. When I first got into this field, I went around the country looking at some of the organizations that had a reputation for high quality, and talked to some of the consultants that were given credit for working with those people. And one of them, a man out of Princeton, New Jersey, asked me if my organization was unionized, and I rather proudly said no. And he said, "Too bad." I said, "What do you mean, too bad? I think that's great that we don't have a union problem." And he said, "Well, let me ask it this way." He said, "How often does your typical general manager stay in his job in your company?" And I said, "Oh, about 2 years." He said, "Okay, I rest my case. For quality to be successful, it has to endure over a long period of time. And if you're changing your management every couple of years, the only organization that is available to maintain that focus and keep the constant purpose is the union." And that, I didn't totally buy into that, but it certainly got me to questioning my thinking on a lot of things. And he was very successful, I think, if he could get people to question their opinions, and that's always positive. But management tends to follow the fad of the year. Every year they come up with a new program. And there's an interesting acronym called BOHICA. Any of you understand what BOHICA stands for? What I've found in traveling around the country is that hourly people in almost any part of the country are very familiar with that term. Maybe only about half the management people are. BOHICA is an acronym for bend over, here it comes again. And I think as management, we are guilty of having a new program every year, and we sort of tend to jerk people around, and they can see what's happening. They understand it. And so sometimes when we're disappointed that people don't embrace our new programs, maybe we need to stop and think about this constancy of purpose. The second deadly disease Deming talked about is emphasis on short-term profits. And this is a very serious problem in our country, in that the way stock is held forces management to make a lot of short-term decisions. As consultants, we can tell the difference between clients, whether or not they're a public or private company, because private companies find it much easier to make decisions based on the long term. Public companies have to keep that quarterly dividend rate up. They have to keep the stock price up, have to keep the earnings up on a quarterly basis. They're forced to make many short-term decisions. And it isn't always just the stockholders, but there's much stock held today by institutional funds, and the fund managers tend to get rated on a daily basis what they've done to increase the value of the fund that day, that there's tremendous pressure on management to make short-term decisions, and don't worry about the long term, because you're not going to be around long term if you don't meet your short-term goals. So emphasis on short-term profits is a very serious problem that we have. The third deadly disease is our personal review system. Deming believed that people were trying to do their best. They were intrinsically motivated. And let's talk a little bit about intrinsically and extrinsically motivated. People really do want to do a good job. When they go to work, they want to be proud of their organization, they want to be proud of the work they do, and most of all, they want to be proud of themselves. But there are barriers in their work that prevent them from doing their best. And so these are problems that we have. Management has to spend their time removing those barriers that prevent people from doing better. Now, if we try to rate people and say, okay, I have 6 people reporting to me and I've got to rank them, we're really only fooling themselves, because people are victims of the process they work in. And if the process is not capable of doing more, then people won't be able to do more. And if we say that Charlie here rates an 8 on his evaluation, well, what part of that 8 is due to Charlie, and what part of that 8 is due to the process that he works in? And for those of you that have been involved in algebra, you know that trying to solve for 2 unknowns with a single equation is impossible, and yet we purport to do that with our ranking system in the workplace. So Deming continued to believe that people are intrinsically motivated, and extrinsically motivated. Motivation only adds to the variation in the system and causes more problems than it solves. An example of that I can share with you, I was invited to our local school board meeting one night in the community I live in. And I wasn't sure why. I was sent this letter by the superintendent of schools, but had a lot of respect for the man, so I went. And the first part of the meeting was normal business, and then the second part, he had 2 teachers present Dr. Deming's 14 points to the board. And with each one, they had 3 columns. The first column is their interpretation of what that point meant to industry. The second column is what their interpretation of what that point would mean to education. And the third column were their recommendations for action items that the school should take. And I thought it was just tremendous, because they really came up with some very thoughtful ideas. And when it was over, a woman seated just a few seats away from me stood up, and she said, I went to this school system. My 2 children graduated from this school system. One of them is valedictorian. It's the finest school system in the country, and I don't see why you think you need to change. And the superintendent's kind of long, lanky guy, kind of sat down and he was sitting down and crossed his legs. He said, well, we've been talking tonight about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. When the children enter our system in kindergarten and the 1st grade, they are intrinsically motivated. They're curious. They want to learn. But something happens within our system that by the time they reach middle school, we feel that we must force them. We must use extrinsic motivation to get them to learn. There is something that's happening within our system that's wrong, and that's why I think we need to change. So I think that was a very good example that was given in education. And by the way, the things we're talking about here today about Dr. Deming's philosophy applies to service organizations just as well as manufacturing organizations. It applies to education, it applies to government, it applies to labor, all elements of our society. It's applicable everywhere. In fact, there are probably a lot more opportunities in service organizations than there are in manufacturing, because we've had industrial engineers working for years in manufacturing organizations, working to improve the manufacturing processes. But how often do you see industrial engineers working on the processes in finance, or in marketing, or in law, or in education? Everything we do is part of a process. The way we go to work every morning, we have a process for doing that. All of our work is a series of processes, and all those processes have variation, and all can be improved. And so that's what we need to understand here. So we're only fooling ourselves when we try to rank people without some understanding of the process and systems they work in. And we'd be better off spending our time improving those processes and systems than would be to worrying about the people, because they will motivate themselves given the right work environment. Disease number 4 is mobility of management, job hopping. We've already talked about that we lose the concept of purpose and we keep jerking people around. Disease number 5 is use of visible figures only. We tend to manage operations by looking at last month's results instead of looking forward. Deming says management is prediction. And we cannot predict without theory. We must have some theory in which we predict the way things will happen. And we can either support or disprove theory. And that's the way we learn. Disease number 6 is excessive medical costs. Lots of things have changed in our country. We now have surgery for items that a few years ago we would not have done. On May 9th, I go to the store and get new knees. I'm going to have my knees replaced. Well, it's not been very long that would have been possible. I would have probably spent the rest of my life in a wheelchair had it not been for the new techniques. There's heart bypass surgery today. We keep people in life support systems for a long period of time. Premature babies care is very, very expensive today. The liability costs for medicine have gone through the roof. And so this is a problem. There's not an easy solution, but the medical costs really are a big barrier to business being successful in worldwide competition today. And disease number 7, sort of parallel with that, is excessive liability costs. And we can tell all sorts of stories here about excessive liability costs of doing business. For one point in time, it totally decimated one industry, and that was the personal aircraft. I think now one company is back producing single-engine planes again. But the liability costs have driven the cost of those planes to make them very, very prohibitive for most Americans. Well, these are things that are wrong with the way we're managing, and Deming's philosophy of management really has not changed much over the years. He sent me a copy one time of this material that he used in 1950 in Japan, and it's fundamentally the same as it is today. But he did not have some things identified, such as the 14 points. But, we Americans, we always want to take shortcuts, right? We want to move faster, and we'll learn more. So people were always asking Deming for, how do I do this? He received a letter one time that said, "No, you're a very busy man, don't have time to come out to my operation. So if you'll just write to me and tell me what to do, then we'll do it in our company." It's not that simple. But he kept getting pressure. And finally, in February of 1981, he was doing a private seminar for one large U.S. corporation. And they put so much pressure on him to come up with some sort of a roadmap that he sat down one night and wrote 11 points of what to do. And when he was presenting it the next morning, he added 3 more. So that was the origin of the 14 points. And I'd like to go through them. In your handout, you got a copy of these 14 points here today. The first one is to create a constant purpose towards improvement of product and service with the aim to become competitive and stay in business and provide jobs. Well, this is sort of the reverse of the deadly disease number 1 on constant purpose, but it's added something I think that's very important. And that is one of the aims of organization today is to provide jobs. It's not just to make money, but is to create something for society, to provide jobs for people. I'm going to say something that 15 years ago I never would have thought I would have said. And then I have a friend back home who is a labor leader. And I first met Bob Killeen when the governor of Minnesota put together a committee to study what could be done to improve the economy of the state. And I wasn't very sure why I got invited because I was a Republican and this guy was a Democrat, but I showed up at the room in the state capitol. And to my dismay, I found out the chairman of the committee was this labor leader. I mean, and this guy looks like a labor leader. He's about as tall as I am, but about twice as broad across the shoulders. And I think I've seen him wear a necktie about 5 times in the 10 years I've known him. He usually has a shirt unbuttoned to the waist and a big heavy gold chain, and he talks just about like you would expect a labor leader to talk. But the man is so sincere that I really do respect him tremendously. But he said the role of labor leaders has changed today, just like management. That you cannot lead a union today the way you did in the 30s. And this man is a personal friend of Walter Reuther's, and he said he's led more than his share of wildcat strikes in his life, and so on and so forth. But he said if he were active today, he would put quality on the table as a strike issue. He said, either you do it or we walk. Because he believes sincerely the role of the union is to provide job security for the people, and if the organization does not have a quality program, they're not likely to be around to provide jobs for the people. And so Bob loves point number 1, to create a constant purpose, to become competitive, stay in business, and provide jobs. And that's what he's very interested in, provide jobs. Point number 2 is to adopt a new philosophy. Deming used to say survival is not mandatory. And change is not optional. We are in a new economic age. Whether we like it or not, things have changed, and we need to change with it. And there's a better way of managing today. Most of us understand that we cannot sit in the driver's seat and crack the whip over the people anymore. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that to empower the people, they must move to the back of the wagon, sit in the fetal position, and hope like heck that the team's going in the right direction. Well, that's not leadership either. And so what we need to do is to take a look at getting it down off the driver's seat, getting in front of the horses, walking through the muck and mire, leading the team in the right direction. So management's job is to provide the aim for the new organization, to adopt a new philosophy. Now, if we could get some lights for a while, I would like you to do something for me. What I'd like you to do is to close your eyes for a minute and envision the best boss that you ever worked for. Paint this picture of this person vividly in your mind. See the character, the behavior, the way this person treated you, and paint that very clearly in your mind. After you've done that, would you find a piece of paper, write down 10 adjectives to describe it. Just simple one-word adjectives that best describe this person, 10 of them. Okay, what are some of the adjectives that you came up with? Shout them out to me if you would. A listener, good listener. Good. Pardon? Honest? What? Caring. You know, honest, caring, aren't these kind of Boy Scoutish things? We're talking about the real world. What constitutes a good boss in the real world? Pardon? Supportive? Dedicated? I'm sorry? Visionary. Consistent. Respectful. Pardon? Equal? Okay, good answers. I first ran into this exercise, a man named Ron Wiley gave it to a small group of his friends. And I said honest, and he's the one that jumped on me. He said, you know, that's kind of Boy Scoutish, Schultz. But yet the other answers came out the same way, just like you said. And what Wiley ended up saying was, if you really want to learn how to be a good boss, read the Boy Scout manual. It's all there. And so Wiley says that he has conducted this little test with 10,000 people, and he's kept data on the answers. His answers you gave. It turns out that AMA has conducted a similar type test at their seminars, and AT&T has conducted a similar test with their employees. Look at number one answer on all three groups: honest. And knowledgeable and competent are very similar, I think, from the number two answer. So let me ask you this question. Those of you that are in management, how do you think your people would describe you if you asked them to write 10 adjectives to describe you? Or how do you value the people that you work for? Are these the sort of things that you judge the people on? Yet you're saying these things describe the best boss you ever had. So I think this is something to think about when we talk about leaders. Another thing that leaders have to understand is what their organization is really like, how the work is done in the organization. And Deming said, you do not understand your business unless you can draw a picture of that business, a flow diagram. And so you need to start out with the suppliers on the left side. It makes no difference whether it's manufacturing or service organization. Who provides the input to the organization? And then what are the steps through the process as viewed by the work as it flows through your organization? The product or the service that flows through. What's the first step, second step? In other words, internally, which processes are the suppliers and customers of each other? And then goes to the output to distribution and then to the ultimate consumers. With the feedback loop there coming back of consumer research and marketing, feeding back to both the suppliers and to design in the organization. This one is sort of focused on manufacturing, but you can draw a very similar diagram of any service organization. And so Deming says any leader, to understand their organization, must be able to draw a picture of the organization and how it works. We do this with our clients, and it's very interesting how that works out, because I can remember the president of one organization presented this picture to his staff, and one person in the back of the room said, "Hey, you forgot about me. My organization doesn't appear on your chart." Well, after some discussion, it was found out that that organization really did not contribute value to the product or service, and they were disbanded and reassigned in other places because the chart showed that they were not contributing value to the work of the organization. So we see all sorts of things happen when people start to do this, and it's very interesting. You put things on paper in black and white, and it will talk back to you. In fact, this is not exactly a statistical model, but I like to think of statistics as a language that allows the work to talk to us. It will tell us when to take action, when not to take action, and what kind of action to take. So if we think of that, it's a very useful tool. A lot of the things we talk about seem very simplistic when we just look at them, but this is something called the PDSA cycle. Deming always called it the Shewhart cycle because he learned it from Walter Shewhart. The Japanese call it to this day the Deming cycle because they learned it from Dr. Deming. But it said that you need to approach improving a process or solving a problem in 4 stages. First, you need to plan what action you should take. Develop a plan. Develop a theory, right? And we take that theory now, and we're either going to support it or disprove it with our experience. So we develop a theory, we plan, and then we try it, preferably on a pilot basis. And that's the do step, is to try that theory, and then we either, as I said, support it or disprove it. We study the results, and then we take action based on that study. And if the data confirms our theory, then we roll it out to the rest of the organization, and we document it, standardize on it, so we don't slip back the old way. If it does not support our theory, then we go into another planning cycle and try something else. And so we're constantly rolling this wheel of plan, do, study, act. And this becomes a way of thinking that is very, very useful, even though it looks very simple. Does all this stuff work? Well, of course it works. There are lots of success stories that we can talk about. We certainly have seen the success in Japan. We're seeing it in this country. Ford Motor Company did a big turnaround under the leadership of Donald Peterson. Unfortunately, since he's left, they've lost a bit of their focus on quality and on Deming theory. But it's been proven there. There are lots of other success stories we talk about. One of them that's very close to me is an organization called Zytec. Zytec manufactures power supplies for electronics, and it seemed like a pretty simple thing. And many of us were convinced that the Japanese and the Koreans were going to just knock them off and drive them out of business. And they bet their future on managing by the Deming theory. And the results have been that they have not only survived, they're now selling back into Japan. They have shut down their plant in Mexico and moved the jobs back to Minnesota, where they can produce them better and cheaper using quality methods. And that's what it's all about, bringing jobs back to our country. They are growing at a rate of 50% a year. They've won the Minnesota Quality Award. They've won the Baldrige Award. And they're making a tremendous amount of money and growth and very, very successful. And Ron Schmidt, the CEO, is asked to speak many places, and he usually starts out his talk as I'm very glad to be here today, and if it were not for Dr. Deming, I would not be, because my company would not have survived. And he's very sincere in meaning that. The Naval Shipyards in Pearl Harbor, huge organization, was forced to compete with civilian shipyards today. And they embraced the Deming philosophy, and they have taught the philosophy to all of their thousands of employees. They've taught statistical tools to all of their thousands of employees. Today, they have a problem with concept purpose like any other military organization, and the commanding officers are rotated every 2 or 3 years. But they managed to bring in the new commanding officer a year early and spend a year training him to take over that very responsible position. Part of it, training is on Deming, part of it's on statistics, part of it is actually sending him to Japan to study. And I say him because all the ones I've known since I've been associated with them have been males. Doesn't mean that it will be in the future. But they have kept this concept, folks. And after the first year and a half, they published a paper that's in public domain, presented in Washington, D.C., and they kept track of all of their costs of implementing a quality program. And they came up with a number of $18 million in a year and a half. But what they did, they kept track of all the time that all of the people spent in meetings talking about quality, all of their training, anything that had anything remotely to do with quality, they threw into this bucket, kept track of the expenses. But in a paper said in that same time period, they were able to save $24 million. So they feel they were ahead $6 million in that first year and a half. And not only that, but in the future, their expenses would go way down. They would need to have some continual training, but the big bubble of training up front was over, and their expenses would go down, and they expected their gains to continue to increase, so it'd be much better off. Ethel Corporation had a small division that produced plastic film, and they embraced the Deming philosophy, and they taught the Deming theory to every one of their employees and taught statistics to every one of their employees, and they profited mightily from this. And their corporate management asked, take some of this money that you're making, go buy another company and run that the way you're running this company. And one of the managers said, well, gee, we don't know what company to buy. We're not experienced in doing that. We know how to run this company. We don't know how to run other companies. So they were forced into it, though, when corporate management of Ethel decided to split the company in half and form two companies, Ethel and Tredegar. And guess where the management team of Tredegar came from? From the little division corporate management, moved them all up to run this huge new company. So there are lots of success stories we can talk about on this. Well, let's continue to go through these 14 points here. Point number 3 is cease dependence on inspection. We used to have inspectors inspecting inspectors' work, and as a result, no one was responsible because everyone said, well, they'll catch it over there. It's better to have workers inspecting their own work, and I think each of us want to be proud of our work, so we'll take that responsibility for inspection. And we have built up over the years many, many layers of management. And quite frankly, that's not very satisfying. You'd really rather be contributing to the work itself. So what Deming said, stop depending on inspection to catch defects, because it's too late. The bad products and services have already been produced. We need to improve our processes so we don't produce the defects in the first place. Number 4 is to stop the practice of awarding business that is based on, instead, the total cost of the entire system should be looked at, and that we need to develop a partnership with our suppliers, and you cannot do that if you have more than one for each commodity. So over the years, Ford and General Motors have listened to him, and they have now focused on getting one supplier for each commodity in the automobiles to reduce variation in the input. And that's what we're trying to do, is reduce variation in our processes. And if we have more than one supplier, we most assuredly will have variation. Now, there's some cases where one supplier can't supply all the needs. For example, no grower grows enough chickens to supply a Campbell chicken soup factory. So they have to take chickens from different growers. You wouldn't think there would be variation between the chickens from one supplier to another, would you? Well, at this particular plant, When they switch chickens from one supplier to another, they announce it with a public address system so the operators can jump up and start tweaking their machines, because there is variation in the way chickens are grown from one supplier to another. And it's a very delicate process of stripping the meat off the bones and so on and so forth. So we need to work in partnership with our suppliers, and you really cannot do that with more than one supplier for each item. Number 5 is increased costs. This is where we get into using the statistical tools in the process that we need to constantly and forever and relentlessly. What we're talking here is that you do have some formal training and coaching of the people so they know how to do it right from the beginning. 7 is leadership must be instituted, and we've talked a good bit about leadership already. The aim of leadership should be help people and machines do a better job. Leadership of management as well as leadership of the workers is in need of an overhaul. So we need to change the way that we're leading the organization. 8 is to drive out fear so everyone may work effectively for the organization. Fear can really be a huge obstacle to getting the work done in an organization. And Deming used to distinguish between 2 types of fear that he called fear and anxiety. Fear is brought about by people is always a negative, but that can be overcome. You can change that. Anxiety is something that he said is brought about by events or environment. You may be virtual education will replace the need to have a campus with walls and classrooms. And that can be either good or bad. If it encourages you to make better use of what you have or to get on board with a new way of doing things, that could be positive. If you just throw up your hands and say, well, there's not going to be a need for us in the future, so we don't want to do any more maintenance on the buildings and we don't want to spend any more money, then that can be negative. So it's very useful to, I think, use those 2 views of types of fear, anxiety and fear, and to drive out fear in the organization so people are at ease and secure in their organization. Point number 9 is management must break down barriers between departments. And I think there's a little bit of paranoia in each one of us. We tend to build up walls around us if left to our own devices. And we build up our own little fiefdoms in our organizations. And we really need to think of the whole and to tear down those barriers between departments and work for the betterment of the entire organization. 10 is management must eliminate slogans and exhortations and targets asking for 0 defects, new levels of productivity from the workforce without providing them with methods with which to achieve it. I think one of the areas in which we really violate this point is in safety. We'll tend to put up signs that say, don't slip on the oil slick on the floor, when we should be working to find the device that's leaking oil and put a new gasket in it so it doesn't leak oil on the floor anymore. And so what we really need to do is to work to improve the processes, not to exhort the people. And you're really insulting people. And, think about one of the very large organizations in this country used to have a big campaign that they exhorted their workers to think. And they put up signs all over, and they made little plates for people's desks that said think, and signs on the wall. And this is implying that the people aren't already thinking, that they needed to have some poster in front of them that says think. And that's really an insult to the people. And so what we need to do is to stop exhorting the people and start doing our job, and that's improving the processes. 11 is management should eliminate work standards and replace it with leadership. And I think an example of that, this is really people taking a crutch to use them to help do their job of management rather than understanding the process and improving them. An example is my home county, Hennepin County, Minnesota. A few years ago, the road repair crews were required to repair so many potholes per day. It did not take into consideration how deep the potholes were, how wide they were, or how much traffic was on the road that they were trying to repair. They just had a number that they had to meet. And what the workers told me was that If they didn't have that quota system, they probably, on an average, would repair a lot more potholes than they do under that system. Point number 12 is my favorite one, I think, of all of these. And it said, management must remove the barriers that rob the workers of their right of pride of workmanship. I think that's wonderful, because first of all, that says a number of things. One is, it says that people want to be proud of their work. Don't you want to be proud of your work? You go to the work in the morning, see how you can screw up? Okay, people want to be proud of their work. And two, it says that the workers have a right to be proud of their work, and who are we to take that right away from them? What we need to do is to improve our processes and systems that people work in so they can get more satisfaction from their work. You know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs started out with security and then food, or safety and food, and went on up the line until you got to satisfaction. I think most of us are, we have some concerns about paying our bills and that, but most of us really work to get satisfaction out of our work. I was very pleased with my son yesterday morning. He worked all weekend at his job till late at night, and was up early in the morning, and I told him I'm really proud of him for doing that, and he said, it's not work when you enjoy what you're doing. I think that's neat, you know. And so if we can create the work environment that our people enjoy what they're doing, it's not work to them anymore, it's something they enjoy. And after all, we spend so much time in our workplace, isn't it a shame if we don't enjoy it? If we don't have joy in work? And who can create the processes and systems and the environments people work in to give them that satisfaction of doing something worthwhile? It's management. Point number 13 is to institute a vigorous program of education self-improvement. Well, I said 6 and 13 are like. 6 was training and involved skills training. 13 is education. Now, it used to be that we went to school and completed our education, then went to work. And I don't think that that's a useful saying anymore, because we need to continue to study our entire lives today. We can never be satisfied with what we know, because the world's changing so fast around us. You know, my father used to tell me about courting in a horse and buggy. And he said, that wasn't bad, because the horse knew the way home, and he could go to sleep on the way home. And he said more than once he woke up in the morning sitting in front of the barn. Well, think of it. My father lived from the horse and buggy days to the automobile, to the airplanes, to the man in the moon. What do you suppose your children will say about you someday, about what you've seen in your lifetime? I mean, it's beyond our ability to imagine some of the changes that we're going to see in the rest of our lives. So with the world changing, we have to continue to learn to stay up. The 14th and last point in Deming's philosophy is an easy one. It's a piece of cake. All you have to do is put everyone in the organization to work to complete the transformation. In other words, 14 says do it. And you can't do it by yourself. It requires everyone. I did some work for a while with the company that's usually regarded as the best example of a successful company in this country, and that's Walmart. And I picked up the autobiography, of Sam Walton. And to my surprise, I think it was page 186 in there, it said that being an avid student of management philosophy, I studied the works of W. Edwards Deming in the middle 70s. Think about it, the middle 70s, that's before most of us ever heard of Dr. Deming. Now that was before the NBC white paper. The Japanese knew of him, but we didn't in this country. And Sam Walton said, and then Helen and I, his wife, traveled to Japan to see how they were actually implementing it. And that's when I first realized the future of our organization belonged to the empowerment of the associates. And they do that today. There's something over 700,000 employees, and they have 4 levels of management in the organization. 700,000 person company, they only have 800 people at their headquarters, and that includes the people that run their sophisticated satellite system for communications and their computer system and all that. So it does work, and there are lots of examples. Well, in his later years, Deming still presented the same philosophy, but he presented it in a little bit different way, and he talked about his profound knowledge. And when I first heard that, I thought, gee, that sounds like kind of a lofty term, profound knowledge, and kind of strikes me negatively. But knowing Deming, he usually had reason for something. So I looked up the words profound and knowledge in the dictionary and found out that profound means deep understanding. Well, that's pretty good. And knowledge means perceived truth. Well, that's pretty good too. And after all, isn't that why we're here trying to study this? Is to gain a deeper understanding of the perceived truth of how management should operate. So maybe it's a pretty good term after all. Well, let's talk about that. There are 4 points of profound knowledge. And the first one is an appreciation for a system. And we talked about this, being able to draw the organization as a system and to be able to take action based on the benefit of the whole, not our own individual departments, our own little fiefdoms, but take the action for the benefit of the whole. And to do this, we need to understand all the components of that system. We need to understand how they interact with each other. And if we take action in this area, what's that going to do to the other areas? And we start to think just a little bit more deeply about the organization and how we approach it. The second point is theory of knowledge. Each of the people in the organization are different. And we need to understand how they learn, because some of us learn better by looking at graphs or pictures, some by the printed word. Some can't learn from the printed word at all. They have to listen from sound or learn by experience. Each of the people learn in different ways, and we need to understand the theory of why we do things and be able to predict from that theory. The third point of profound knowledge is knowledge variation. Again, this is where we get back to the statistics, that every process in the organization has variation. There is no such thing as an absolute. What's the speed of the light? Well, that's changed over the years, right? As we've developed different ways of measuring the speed of light, we've actually changed what we call an absolute number is. Deming used to say that, in fact, he claimed to quote Galileo from a statement in 1606 that if the speed of light is not infinite, it's awful damn fast. But we talk about measuring something as 12 inches long. Well, what's 12 inches? Well, it's 12 inches compared to some standard we have back at the Bureau of Standards. It's at a constant temperature. But our ability to measure that comparison is always plus or minus something. So there's variation in every process. Nothing is absolute. No statistician would tell you that anything is absolute. So we need to understand variation and what type of variation we have, because that will tell us what action to take, what not to take, and when to take it and when not to take it. And then the fourth part of profound knowledge is appreciation for psychology. And this is kind of an interesting one, and maybe a little bit surprising to talk about this physicist that became a statistician talking about psychology. But I think most managers understand that people have changed today. You know, the days when people do as they're told and are quiet are over. Because with the improved communications and transportation we have today, people need to understand why. And so we need to understand the psychology of how people interact to each other, how they interact to the equipment, to the processes they work in. And we need to understand psychology and how to deal with people and work with the people. So that's a very quick understand the bridge to the future in our organizations. So let's talk about the future a little bit. As I said, the change is upon us. It's not optional. You know, whether we like it or not, the world's changing, and the way we must behave is changing, whether we're leaders or workers. I believe it was Forbes magazine, and I need to look this up, that had an article some time ago about the 10 leaders of the world, 10 people who did the most to shape the world. And they had the Apostle Paul, one we don't like so much, Adolf Hitler, but they also had Dr. Deming as listed as one of the 10 people who have done the most to shape the world. And what he'd done in Japan, and then what he'd now done in this country. So we need to return to the basics. Now, as I mentioned, Dr. Deming put on these 4-day seminars around the world. He typically would put on 24 or 25 seminars a year, so that's one every other week. The intervening weeks he would consult the last few years, mostly with General Motors and Ford. And Deming's typical work week, on Sunday, after Sunday evening, he'd get on a train for New York. He lived in Washington, D.C. He'd get on a train for New York where he had an apartment and stay overnight because he taught at NYU and Columbia every Monday. Then he would fly out Sunday night or Monday night to wherever he was conducting the seminar that week. And then Tuesday through Friday, he would conduct that seminar. And then Friday night, if the location permitted, he'd fly back to Washington, or if he couldn't get back to Saturday morning, fly back Saturday morning. And then he would have meetings on Saturday and do work in his office on Saturday and Sunday night. Sunday mornings he'd go to church and then work in the afternoon until it was time to get on the train to go to New York. And he did this for a long time. I mentioned earlier he was born in 1900, and he died in December of 1993, and he finished his last seminar of the year 10 days before he died at age 93. He was a very driven individual, but I think that had a lot to do with him living to the age he did. I think we need a reason to live in retirement, and the statistics are awfully high. People die within a few years after retirement, within a year or two after retirement, because they lose their purpose in living. And so it's very important that we have some outlet, something we're doing that we get satisfaction from, I think, as long as we're alive. And Deming certainly did that. But once a semester at NYU, he had this sort of a mischievous bent to him also. And he would ask the students, he said, tell me, what other courses are you taking out there that will help to contribute to the United States balance of trade? He said it was interesting to watch the students' faces because he could just see them sit there and think for a while and then start to get red in the face. They got very upset because their other classes were not preparing them to do anything to have a positive impact on our balance of trade. So we have to make sure that we're doing something that does make a contribution. Good intentions are not enough. They must be accompanied by profound knowledge. Quality for international trade must be good enough to command a market for our organizations. And again, we are in a worldwide market today, whether we like it or not. Our competition is not just from across the street, across town, or even across state. It can come from anywhere in the world today. And we must be prepared for that. I talked this morning about intrinsic motivation, and Deming strongly believed that workers are doing their best. And it's time for American managers to wake up. Deming always concluded his seminars the same way. He said, I'd like to leave you now with 5 words. I have done my best. Thank you very much. Thank you.